So, we are working with social justice, theories, issues, and movements. And we are on chapter 3, which is all about distributive justice. There is an accompanying PDF lecture to this video that you should remember to download, and it will help you with some of the notes. First of all, the chapter starts with the definition of distributive justice. It is having to deal with notions of fairness in the distribution of benefits and burdens in a society. You might be asking what that means. Well, it's tied to this idea of moral guidance involving the everyday choices that we make in society. And chapter 3 starts off with a lot of really good questions about distributive justice. They are, what are the benefits and the burdens? This involves issues around economics, education, jobs, health resources, opportunities. What are the factors that need to be considered? These include equality, differences, whether someone just has an abundant amount of luck, who or what matters for this kind of justice in society. This includes humans, different social relationships we might have, animals, the environment. Agency is a factor. Do we have free will or individual responsibility? And finally, how do we ensure that distributive justice is equal for all? And this involves the state, could involve the government or non-government organizations. So these are some of the questions that the first chapter starts off with to get you into this topic. It then goes on to traditional political philosophical views about distributive justice. And there are 3 main points that the book explores. These include 1, equality, 2, need, and 3, deserts. The first one, equality, is attributed to Aristotle, and it's the idea that everyone is fundamentally equal and should therefore be treated equally. And the book goes into a little bit about the 14th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution and Rawls' idea of difference principle. But in actuality, we know equality isn't so easily obtained, especially if you have been following the news articles and the movements that are happening right now. Not all people are treated equally in terms of justice and the law. Need is a really fascinating category, and it involves Karl Marx. And there's this idea that from each according to his or her or their ability, to each according to his, her, or their need. And the chapter will discuss this a little more in depth as you keep reading, because there's a big section on Karl Marx. He's a big figure in terms of social justice studies and in how society can be arranged to help the many. The real question is, what constitutes need? What do people really need? And some of those questions are asked in this section. The final one is deserts, and it's traced to Plato, John Locke, even Aristotle. And it suggests that each person should receive for their efforts their dues. So you might have heard the phrase, you're getting your just deserts, right? and it's involving the amount of work that you put in, your production, your motivation. It will produce what you deserve. And again, we know that is not the case for everyone, and that there are extenuating factors that influence whether or not people have the same opportunities as others. After that section, we hit a segment where it talks about classic social theorists on justice. And there are 3 that are highlighted. In your PDF lecture notes, I have listed them: Durkheim, Weber, and Karl Marx. And when you print it, you might make some notes by their names of points that are standing out as important within each theorist. There is a lot of condensed information here, so it's really easy, it might be really easy to get overwhelmed as you're reading it, which is why I stress that you should highlight the points that stand out to you. So for instance, with Durkheim, on page 42 of the printed textbook, there's this idea of what is moral. And I have noted that as an important concept that stood out to me. And I have also noted in that section that thinking of others is moral, and maybe something that we don't often do outside of our small family community unit. It's much easier to be moral when it's directly affecting someone we know versus, well, I don't know that person in another country who is being negatively affected by what is going on. So it's easier to distance yourself from the issue. I also noted for Durkheim that at the bottom of page 43, there's some discussion about contracts, social contracts, and work contracts. As you progress into Max Weber's section, you will start hitting a lot about capitalism. This is really important in order to understand where we are in a society here in the United States. Specifically at the top of page 47, there's a section about how the individual is privileged in our society over the collective. So an individual person who has worked hard and amassed their wealth, they are allowed to maintain or keep that wealth even in the face of a segment of the population that is in extreme poverty or need. And I think a good example is, for instance, maybe walking around in San Francisco. I took my daughter there when she was maybe 4. I don't remember how old she was. And as we were walking, she asked me why people were sitting outside sleeping against some of the buildings. And she pointed out that there were such beautiful looking homes and buildings there. So why would people need to sleep outside in the cold? And it was a tough conversation to have because she was faced with this notion of extreme wealth from the city and from those who can afford to live in the city, and then extreme poverty from those that are wanting and in need and don't have a place to sleep. As you progress with Weber, there's a discussion of 4 forms of justice, and that occurs on page 49, 48 through 49. And then we hit Karl Marx. Karl Marx is someone that I have studied in great depth, especially in grad school. And contrary to what you might know about Karl Marx, his information is not purely or solely about communism. He actually writes a lot about a lot of different forms of government within a society, from slavery, feudalism, socialism, capitalism, communism. So he's talking a lot about all of these issues. And this section does a very good job of giving you a condensed version about his theories. One thing, and of course, please refer back to the notes so you can mark points that are standing out to you. But one thing that is really important here is on page 51. He talks a lot about the base and the superstructure, often formulated in this idea of a pyramid, where at the top you have the select few, like, for instance, the 1%, that make a lot of money. However, Marx points out that their ability to earn that much is purely a result of the base labor, and that it is actually the proletariat that has all the power and that makes it possible for that pinnacle to exist on the superstructure or the macro level of a society. So he talks a lot about ideological state apparatuses on page 52 and how those contribute to this unequal distribution. And if you have questions on that, you can email me. As the chapter concludes, we hit a small section about a social justice model of distributive justice. And there's a few people discussed here, but in the notes for this chapter in the PDF lecture, I really only focus on David Miller. And I mainly do that because it seemed to have the most to do with our current state. David Miller explains that a social justice understanding is one that discovers the underlying principle that people use when they judge some aspect of their society to be just or unjust. And he goes on to describe 3 modes related to this concept. That is the community's view instrumental association is the second, and human relationships as citizenship, which is the third. Basically, you will be figuring out that identity politics do play a role in how we relate to other people, the self to the other. And in general, there are a lot of really good questions asked here at the end. Like most issues and concepts in this class, we get a lot more questions than answers, because if we had all the answers already, we wouldn't have this class and society would look a lot more different than it looks right now. So we're still asking these critical questions. And before I conclude this chapter, I wanted to point out at the end of it on page 62, there is a very small discussion on critical race and postcolonial theorists. This is an area that I have studied in great depth with Chicanx and Latinx studies, my field of study. And I do have some supplemental readings that I will share for those that are interested. And of course, there is a later chapter that talks about those theories. And these are ones that are very much focusing on race issues as it relates to class, as it relates to colonization, as it relates to slavery. So it's an important small conclusion here that you should focus on. If you have any questions, reach out via email.